when we're looking for terpenes are very in conversation right now because people are caught up with the entourage effect, and they're caught up with loud smells and sales. They know that these terpenes have incredible effects on the human in all kinds of ways. But for most of us in terms of cannabis, it's about sales. It's about how do you get a product that is attractive to the buyer, and how do we go about doing this? And I think one of the first things you have to realize is that not every cannabis plant has that ability, just like a lot of people don't. Just because you wish you were a good basketball player, just maybe you're not gonna be. Your genetic potential isn't there. And so when it comes to smells and scents on plants, you're gonna find that within a line, you're gonna find incredible variability. And so for me, from someone who hunts plants to put out as clonal plants for farmers to produce, when I go through these lines, what I'm really trying to find is a plant that has an outward expression that is loud, that seems to hold on to that expression throughout the drying and curing process. And so what we find is that we have varietals that have different, I almost want to call it clingability, but it's the ability for the plant to retain its terpenoidal expression. And a lot of that is through how we process and control, and we'll go into the details. But so much of it begins with, if your product or your plant has low odor to begin with, then expect it to remain that way. You can't really take something that's straw and turn it into gold. And so the first part is, if you're gonna take the time to develop for yourselves, now we're going into a farming age, so if we're gonna start to develop lines of strains and things that we're working with, then you wanna take the time to do enough search to where you have enough of a population to where you can find the sample plant that has the scents and tones that you would like to see exhibited from that display. What I do is I talk to the breeders and I ask them to show me the parental stock. The parental stock lets me take a look at what is it these people are trying to give us as a strain. And so if I can see the tones from the mothers and the fathers, it'll help me understand what the breeder's intent was. I then go through the line seeking out what that expression is, and hopefully we find it, and if not, then the breeder doesn't get a chance to get their work out. But if they do, what we have is we have something that represents what the breeder wants and what the grower wants and hopefully what the market wants. And that searching process has to begin first. So a lot of times when you begin with a clone, it already has a known value. But if you're working on seed, which is where a lot of you are gonna go, remember, as you begin this, you have to start with something that has quality from the beginning. If it's a great producer and it has good, fungal resistance and all these other things that are awesome, but it has a dry, low odor, just know that that will be the case pretty much for that strain. And so we'll move this thing through. But beginning, start with varieties that have qualities that exist. They have to be present. You can't wish them to be there.
Hope you guys are having a good show so far. As Kevin said, the smell and odor associated with cannabis is really important in its marketability. Whether or not the marketability of cannabis is something that everybody in this room wants to focus on. For some people, their journey with cannabis is a little bit more spiritual than that, and we can appreciate that too. But for the moment, we're in the midst of a really dynamic time where a lot of people are having to stake out their position in this marketplace and say, how am I differentiated? I have this strain I've been working on for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and is this the thing that's going to carry me forward? Is this work that I've done, that I've invested in, is the market going to respond to it? And as you know, what's the first thing you do when you pick up a flower? You pinch it and you smell it, right? So I'm a scientist. I'm the chief scientist for Pure Analytics. And I test, so all the cannabis that I ever consume, I test, but what's the first thing I do? So I pick it up and I smell it, right? And that's gonna determine whether or not that's something that I myself is gonna use, not necessarily my test results, but what's my personal response to that? And so we can't lose sight of that when we are making a product that's going into a market where people are gonna compete and decide, we want this or we want that. So in addition to just that smell and that first initial experience with cannabis, terpenes are important to understand if you want to maximize them. And so Kevin was just talking about if you have low odor cannabis, it's going to stay that way. Okay, well, how do we make that an objective thing that we can say, let's measure it. Is that going to be low odor cannabis in the market? Is that going to be something that the market thinks is really great? So when we talk about terpene content in flowers, you expect to see ranges about 2 to 4% by weight. With that 1% really being on the low side. 2%, tends to be average, and 4% tends to be really high. You have terpene content over 4% in a flower, and that's some crazy stuff that you're starting to talk about. You can really perceive the difference between 1% and 4% total terpenes by weight. So just to kind of give you a frame of reference, what's that maybe target zone that you're looking for? Terpenes are really complex substances. There's over 30,000 terpenes in the botanical world. There's certainly not 30,000 in cannabis, but there's a lot of different terpenes out there. And the reason that there's so many terpenes is that there's all these different enzymes that synthesize terpenes in the plant. And they all start with these little diphosphate molecules, and they catalyze them in all these different ways, and it creates this amazing array of terpenes in the cannabis plant that you guys enjoy when you pick up your flowers and you squeeze them and you smell them. Interestingly enough, there's a couple of different kinds of terpenes, and one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that cannabinoids themselves are in that class of compounds, same class as terpenes. We have things that are smaller terpenes, and we have things that are bigger terpenes that are heavier. Those smaller terpenes like myrcene and pinene and limonene, those are the things that you're smelling, that you're perceiving when you're actually pinching a flower and smelling it. But there's actually also a lot of terpenes that you're not going to experience that way because they're not so volatile, right? So they're a little bit heavier and they stick around. You're going to experience them when you smoke them or when you vaporize them, but not so much when you pinch them and smell them. So it's really those monoterpenes that people are perceiving when they're saying, wow, that smells good to me when I pinch it and smell it. So we're talking about those really volatile guys up at the very beginning. So when you think about what's my total terpene content, so I just gave you that kind of 2 to 4% number, so what does that really mean to me? Well, it actually matters what amount of that is monoterpenes versus these sesquiterpenes that are bigger and heavier, because the people aren't going to perceive those big sesquiterpenes. So if all you have is a sesquiterpenes, it still might not smell like anything, and you could have 4% terpenes. So it's a balance between all those different things. One of the things that people always ask me about terpenes is they want to do strain identification based on them. They want to look at a terpene profile and a fingerprint and say, that's sour diesel and that's OG Kush. And a lot of people have been interested in that for a long time. And probably one of the first papers that was written on that was back in 2004. That's a while ago. It's been a while. It's been 12 years. And in the work that they did in that paper, it became fairly clear that it's really difficult to say indica this and sativa this. What they were able to say more realistically is that based on a certain terpene profile or cluster, you can say it had a likely origin from a certain geographic region. So that is something that you can do with terpenes, although there's a lot of gray around that, so to speak, because of all of the mixing and interference that us humans have done in strains and in varieties. So you do have to take that with a grain of salt, and unfortunately, terpenes isn't going to be the thing that lets you fingerprint and say, this is sour diesel, this is OG Kush. So sorry to burst the bubble. I know everybody wants it to be that way, but so far the work doesn't suggest that. One of the things that I think is cool for the farmer is that you can also influence the expression of terpenes through your terroir, through the processing of your cannabis as well. So that environment in which you grow it and what's in your soil, it matters for the expression of terpenes. It's about the metabolic engine that is in your plants and feeding it all of the right things so that it has all the building blocks it needs to create all those compounds that you're interested in. So first is great nutrients and great soil and great terroir. When you have things like pest invasions and diseases, that also affects the ability of the plant to produce things like terpenes, because it diverts that metabolic energy of the plant away from doing things like terpene biosynthesis to fighting this disease. So using biologicals and keeping your plants really healthy so they are, have strong immune systems and can fight off the powdery mildew and fight off the botrytis. That's important, maximizing your terpene content too. I know that Patrick's done a lot of work on soil development and how soil can influence terpenes, and I think he's got a lot of great things to say about that as well.
Well, I hope so. How you guys doing today? Well, I started looking at it because I want to. How do you make good terpenes in your plants? So when I looked at, well, what are terpenes? And if you look at, they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So there's nothing you can put in the soil to make terpenes. The plant makes the terpenes, and what's really interesting to me is those atoms all come from the atmosphere. Nothing comes from the soil, and plants have this amazing ability to arrange carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen sometimes, and if they add nitrogen, it really gets crazy. But all these chemicals that the symbiosis that plants create for us come from the atmosphere. So in my mind, I think, well, we need a good factory. So you really do. You want to make a healthy plant that has the biological engines that can take the atmosphere and rearrange it to make pleasant molecules for us. And it makes myriads, thousands of them. So again, you want to get the biological engines working. And organic matter, I look at everything living needs about 20 elements or so just to be able to survive. So for thousands of years, I looked at nature, I'm real big on looking at nature. If you eat something that it used to be living, it has everything you need in it. We figured that plants and animals eat plants and animals. So I'm not big on salt fertilizers, but if you just re-amend the soil with organic material, things that used to be alive. If it used to be alive, by definition, it has the 18 elements that are required for life. So they're all there, available to the plant. And that's what we've been doing. If you eat plants or animals, kind of cover, you make a healthy factory. A healthy factory can take the atmosphere and turn it into beautiful things. And it's pretty simple, but it's starting with good genetics, organic matter in the soil, and a good environment, and it's very simple.
And then I think you really have to take it back to processing, because you can do a great job on the growing side and developing the terpenes, and then you can throw it all away when it comes to post-harvest activity. I think one of the things that is often tempting, especially in environments where maybe you're having to dry in a shed or an outdoor environment that's not completely cut off from moisture, and you have this battle with both moisture and temperature, using fans and sources of heat involved in your processing and curing. You just have to be really careful with that. If you think about, if you can smell something with your nose, that means it's actually volatilizing off of the plant at that point, because those molecules are entering your nose, which means they're leaving the plant. So any heat that you add to the environment, or any excessive heat in your environment, let's say you've got a dehumidifier running and it's getting up to 85 in that room while you're curing, you're going to be volatilizing off your monoterpenes, which are the ones that the user is going to perceive the most. You're just going to be getting rid of those guys. And so your processing is really important. Another thing that can have a significant influence is the time that it takes for your drying to happen. We can all get really anxious about the environmental moisture and throw fans on our plants and do a lot of things to help aid in drying, but we may also be aiding in terpene dissipation. And I know that Kevin spent a lot of time on working out what are some great post-harvest methods to really retain your terpene content.
What we saw too was at the end of the cycle, it's just for all of us, most of us are running organic, and at some point you're going to have to, if you want to just survive in the business, because the synthetic end is really the impact's too great. And so as we start moving forward with it, whether you're running probiotically or you're running biotically, meaning you're running in anaerobic type, bokashi, grokashi type environment, or you're running blown compost tea, both methodologies are driving a process. And so you're having this engine we're talking about, but what drives the engine is the biological machine within that soil. And so what we found is that when we really start to run the biology heavy near the end of the cycle, and we drive these plants to really consume all that's possible, the intensity, the smell that came out of the plants was insane. And then from that point, it was trying to keep them anything under 80, period. And it's tough because when you're harvesting pot here in southern Humboldt, just the exterior temperature is still 96, 97 at that time of the year during the day. And so it makes it tough. And what you end up doing is you flash off all these monoterpenes that we're talking about, and you end up having a product that loses its delicate nature. So we have all these OGs and all these heavy fuels, and you'll still have that gaseous background, but you'll lose the lemons, you'll lose the limes, you'll lose all the little tones that differentiate your product from others. And so much of it is trying to get this crop, cut it early, and most people, I think they cut too much at one time. So you end up chopping too much shit, and you end up sticking it in the back of a truck. I mean, I got pictures. We all got pictures. I'm serious. We all got pictures. Trucks. And it ends up overheating the cannabis just because you have all this warm cannabis sitting in a giant pile. And so it's heating up as you're waiting to move it to the barns and all this other stuff. So if everything can get cut cooler and smaller and done over a little better sequence, we notice we lost a lot less of the overall quality. And then the ability to, it's easier now, but you had to have infrastructure to do this, but you had to have enough power so that you could run, AC units to cool down these spaces so that you can use the AC units as dehumidifiers, but you're not bringing the temps over like 78. And if you can keep these strains in these ranges, you'll preserve all these delicate, extremely valuable terpenes. They're valuable for us in terms of consumption because they make you feel good. They're uplifting terpenes. But when we're talking about sales of cannabis, which is where I focus most of my time, it had best have that bright light, very vibrant, instantly smell and tone. And you don't get that volatility to come out of the bag if we've removed it in our processing. And so it's a difficult situation. I saw something that was pretty interesting one time, and it just let you kind of see what happens in terms of where the plants are grown, where we had 3 growers that were all in Mendo, but one was on the coast, one was on an interior valley, and then the next one was on the valley over. But they were all within maybe 10 miles of each other in this line. And they were all in the same exact line off the coast, and all 3 guys knew each other well, and they were all very good growers. And so they all used to laugh because they all grew the same strains, and the expression was radically different on each one of their farms, and they used the same compost mixes. I mean, they were identical in production methodology, but you got to see what climate influenced on the strain. And it was a sugary plant, which is really greasy, but on the coast it was absolutely aromatic like you wouldn't believe. It just lacked density. And as we moved into the interior Second Valley, it had a good combination of density and the oil. And then on the farthest we went inland, we had great density, but we lost our flash. The monos were gone. And so we see the same thing here. We see, like over in Redding, you're going to see a much denser product. Humboldt, Mendo, it cools down at night. And that nighttime drop almost allows these terps to restore. And if we can get a little more coastal, you even have a louder piece. And so it's really a lot of people trying to find where in their grow situation and how do they find what variety that works, that holds, and then they optimize their drying situation to work too. Right now it's trying to use your skills until we have technology that's readily available, where you have climatically controlled booths that are pretty affordable to work. Otherwise, you're still using hillbilly technology, but we've been using it for a long time and we're pretty good at it. It's just a matter of trying to keep the temps under 80 is the main point.
When we talk about marketability and sales, one of the first rules in marketing is you have to have a sustainable competitive advantage, right? A sustainable competitive advantage means your competitor can't just go out and buy it. So when we talk about the strains that you develop yourself that other people don't have, those are one of your clearest sources of a sustainable competitive advantage as somebody who's going to be a supplier into a medical or a recreational market. And when we look at a sustainable competitive advantage, it needs to be differentiated, right? So it needs to be different than the thing that the other guy has, or it's just like the same thing the other guy has, right? It's not worth anything special. When you start looking at terpene data in cannabis, and even just in 100 samples, you'll see really clearly that certain terpenes, they're always there. It's very rare that they're not there. Alpha pinene, beta pinene, myrcene, beta carophylline is always going to be there because that's the one they train the drug dogs to. Alpha humulene. There's a lot of these terpenes, they're always there. A little bit of linalool, a little bit of fenchol. But there's some terpenes, we do a list of 25 at Pure Analytics. There's some of those 25 I've never seen. In the thousands of samples that we've done, I've never seen them. And so that means there's rarity to be had in terpene profiles in cannabis. So there's things that are very ubiquitous, and there's things that are very rare. Like ossamine, you don't see that very often. 3-carine, you don't see that very often. So there's certain terpenes that if you're doing sorting through your genetics, and really when you're looking at terpenes, it really does need to be on the final product. At Pure Analytics, we do a lot of vegetative stage testing for cannabinoid optimization, but that's very difficult to do for terpenes. So in looking at your terpene profiles, you're really going to be looking at your final fluorescent flowers. And as you're looking through those, if you're testing for terpenes, if you start to see some things that are, wow, I see the pinene, I see the limonene, I see the myrcene, that's in everything. But that 3-carine, I've never seen that in anything. And look, here it is in this one plant. Well, let's say you end up with a female that has some decent carrying expression. That might be an interesting one to enter into a breeding program. Then you have other terpenes like neurolidol that are present on a more frequent basis, although still somewhat rare, but they seem to impart some particular attributes that the market responds to very strongly. So there's some, when you start to look at terpene data, if you start to explore doing terpene testing with your flowers, you'll start to see some really clear patterns and some indications of what's differentiated and maybe some pathways to follow to start to develop your own strains and things that will truly be differentiated and give you that sustainable competitive advantage.
Yeah, a couple of tricks, if you might be interested in, to enhance the expression of the terpenes is if you can do it indoors, it's a lot simpler. What Kevin was saying is absolutely correct. At cooler temperatures, terpenes are expressed a lot more. It's the sunlight that releases them. One trick is keep the plants in the dark at the very end. Harvest maybe a 3 or 4 day dark period if you can. If you're outdoors, tarp them. And the terpenes are building up during that time and they're not being released by the sunshine or the warmth. Some people put ice on the roots to cool it down towards the end. Start with clean, healthy plants and make sure they go healthy all the way through. And the diseases and everything they do, they sap the energy and the energy goes somewhere else. So you want the energy going into the terpenes. And resin production and good smells, that's always a good selling point. I mean, so I've looked at for years and years. If you have those two things, it's usually pretty good. So in the terpenes, I think the resin, 20% of the resin modules are terpenes, so that's where they come from. That's where the THC and CBDs and the terpenes are concentrated into the resin glands. So always look for good resin glands that smell, and it's a couple of tricks to get you there. Yeah. Also measuring the sugar in the leaf. The sugar is real important if you have a Brix meter. That's a really good way to let you know how healthy your plant is. It takes a while to measure to kind of look where plants are and what your ranges are, but one of the best ways to know the health of a plant is how much sugar is in the leaf. It's the starting point.
We notice if the Brix levels are high, if overall your nutrient density levels are high, the plant holds the scent better. I mean, we do it all the time. We'll take good weed that was grown right and put this shit out on a table somewhere, and I'm telling you, it holds. But when you run a beautiful chem bud, it doesn't hold it. I don't care how beautiful it is. That smell dissipates. Something about nutrient density coming out of a biological delivery. It's almost like it creates an oil level, a wax layer, lipid, something. It encapsulates that stuff. So as soon as you break that bud open, it's reeking again. It just holds different. I noticed it. That's really what I started to change my thoughts on it was when we started really looking at probiotics and then really blown compost, where your biology is at a level so above and beyond normal that the plant's almost supercharged from it, and the cannabis holds better. If you do it correctly, I mean, we could really hold cannabis 4 or 5 years in a nitro pack cleanly. We got the ability to do it in this methodology, and people would still have these things. So when you had a bump a year where the weather was banging, you'd be like, hey, that was a year you could store it. And then years in the future where it wasn't, you wouldn't.
And a real important part of the procedure is the drying and curing process is left out a lot. A lot of people, it's done, it's trimmed, it's gone. But what I understand is the chlorophyll in the plant kind of masks the flavors. It gives it a green kind of flavor. Chlorophyll breaks down over time, but it breaks down real efficiently anaerobically. So if you see, I always seal in a jar, and I don't burp the jars. I just make sure it start dry. You definitely don't want to have anything moist. Seal in a jar, 7, 10, 21 days, 30 days. And that chlorophyll has a chance to break down, and then when you open that jar, it really pops because you're not getting any more. Some of the terpenes do break down into smaller terpenes, I believe, over time, so they actually can change a terpene profile. But spend a little time, an extra week or two, in a sealed, airtight container adds a lot of value to your product. Give a little extra time in that process. It's worth it.
So we talked a bit about how you get greater terpene content in your plants, processing, soil, genetics. Talked a little bit about marketing, a little bit about competitive advantages. But one thing we haven't really talked about is we've talked about, terpenes, marketability, because you smell them, people want to smell something. But there's more to it than that on the biochemistry side of things. So why do we care, right? Why do we care about terpenes? Okay, they smell great, right? So we care about that because that's marketability. But certainly the story of terpenes goes beyond that, which is why there's so much interest and why this room is full right now. People are interested in terpenes because there is a clear perception, although not a lot of solid research at the moment, suggesting that there are what are differentiating your experience between different types of cannabis. What's really interesting about, I'll give you some personal anecdotes just to kind of illustrate some of your personal interactions that you might have with terpenes. So I have fibromyalgia. And there's been times in my life where it's been worse and times where it's been better. Right now, I'm in a pretty good place, which is cool. A couple of years ago, I was not. And I was suffering a lot. And actually, my biochemistry, when I was dealing with the fibromyalgia in an intense period, was different than it is now. And strangely enough, fuel strains at that time would cause me to have a sleep attack. And it would, within 5 minutes of, I only vaporize, I don't smoke, but within 5 minutes of vaporizing the flowers, I'd have to be in the bed. And I'd be in the bed for 2 or 3 hours, and then I'd wake up, I'd be ill. I would feel car sick and nauseous and feel really awful. And here I am 2 years later, or 3 years later, and fuel strains are what I vaporize the most of, and they make me feel great. So one of the things when I give patient seminars and talking about, what are the synergy between cannabinoids and terpenes, and people say, well, why do I care about them? Well, there's an influence in terms of the psychoactivity. There may be an influence on your sensations of relaxation or sedation, or maybe even of excitement and euphoria. So there's thinking and indications that terpenes are influencing that total perception or that total experience that you're having with cannabis. And so that's the other reason why we care. We care because there's that initial marketability impact with that smell, and there's something there and it appeals to us. But then there's actually what it does for us. And we're not all necessarily using cannabis medically or using it to treat our fibromyalgia or whatever, but we know that there's things that make us feel good and things that make us feel bad. For me, I'm sorry, Jack, but Jack Herrera makes me feel horrible. It's really funny. And so I tell patients who really care about having a repeatable experience with cannabis, so pay attention to the cannabinoids. Is it THC dominant? Is it CBD dominant? If you're on the CBD side of things, what's the ratio? That definitely matters. But the other things you need to track are kind of like you do wine tasting. Have a little journal, record smell, record taste. And you don't have to use scientific terms, limonene and alpha humulene. You don't need to do that. You can do it like you do with wine. It had, cherries, and it had licorice, and however it is that you perceive those smells, but track them. And when you find cannabis, let's say it's got a really lemony smell to it, and it's got 15% THC and a little bit of CBD. And the next time you go to the person that you get your cannabis from, they don't have that anymore, but they have 5 other things. And if you can kind of remember what were the characteristics of the one that worked for you to address your issue or made you feel good or had a good experience, if you can track back on those same attributes and include both the cannabinoids as well as those flavor and smell aspects to it, you're going to have a lot greater success as a patient or as a provider trying to service patients and align them with cannabis that's right for them. So that's why we care about the terpenes, is because we're really starting to feel like there's a synergy there, although what's a bummer for me as a scientist is that there's a real lack of research on the smoking or vaporizing and inhaling of terpenes and what are those specific effects. At the moment in time, there's a lot of research on terpenes out of the aromatherapy industry, which is mostly nasal inhalation. But I caution people on making direct correlations between the effects that are observed in nasal inhalation versus what happens with vaporizing and smoking and inhaling, because it's a fundamentally different delivery system, and just quite frankly, the work hasn't been done to say, are those correlations valid, or is it different when you smoke and inhale it? So for me as a scientist, I'm excited about looking forward and actually having some research done that gives us some clear directions on what are some of the biochemical reactions that people have to certain terpenes. Although as with cannabinoids, your biochemistry changes, and so does your response to various cannabinoids and terpenes, just kind of like the story about myself that I shared.
As a dispensary operator, what I noticed was the change in clientele over time. So I'm a career cannabis person, and I'm in the dispensary industry, and I see who comes across the counter. And what I saw was this very different group of people, and I would ask them, why are they here? Because they didn't seem to be the typical cannabis consumer. And what it was people who had opiate, I wouldn't say addiction, but needs for opiates due to pain. And so I'm not in pain, so I'm not really aware of how many people are in pain. And as a dispensary operator, you suddenly become aware of it. And what we found was that it was primarily OG Kush that they smoked as the replacement. And what we found was it didn't matter if I went from a 14% underdog to a 28% OG Chem. It wasn't the potency. It was the terp profiles. And so what we found was anybody that was they wanted to switch over from an opiate-based medication, we would recommend them anything that had OG terp profiles, and it didn't make a difference on potency. And that's a huge thing, because if I could go from 14 to 28 and have the same efficacy of treatment, that's not expected. And so what we saw was really, it was this huge population. So we started actually being able to tell people, hey, if you're here for pain relief and you're an opiate user, they couldn't use any other cannabis and get relief. Something about the opiate situation, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know, but it precluded them from gaining relief from anything other than fuel-based strains, regardless of potency. And so it was interesting because it was really the terpenes that were driving this incredible pain relief for these individuals. It was not the cannabinoid content.
Yeah, I love sharing my own stories. You know that, Kevin. So what am I smoking on right now? It's a cherry AK outdoor bio-grown that's out of Spark right now. And then a nice Girl Scout cookies. So that cherry AK, it's at 14.7%, tested by Pure Analytics. And the Girl Scout cookies is about 22%, which is about typical for Girl Scout cookies. I myself have a lot of trouble sleeping, and so I often am trying different varieties of cannabis for sleeping. So I went and I got the cherry AK, I'm like, that's 14.7, there's my daytime, right? And then 22%, that's gonna help me go to sleep. And that's funny, I still intuitively do that because I test it all and I start looking at things through the numbers, you know? And the other day I was like, you know, that 14.7% cherry AK is what's knocking me out. It happens to have 1% myrcene. You know, so for me at this time, with where my biochemistry is, and myrcene has a really strong sleep influence for me, which is great. That's what I need that time. But man, that is not daytime for me, even though it's 14.7% and I can hold my shit. Thank you.
And if anyone's interested after the show, I have a dozen or so pure terpenes up here. I do have myrcene and limonene and pinene. If you want to come and actually smell them and see what they're like in their natural or pure form, you're more than welcome. But they are very interesting. And I think we put in candles or anything, but yeah, come up and have a little whiff of a couple of them.
It's pretty, if you haven't ever experienced it, it's pretty neat to go take a look at what is this smell. When someone said it smells like lavender, or it smells like rosemary, or it smells like this, there's terpenes that are directly correlated to it. And all of a sudden you start to be able to put these patterns together, and it just helps you understand better. But so much of it is it's individual. You know, for me, cannabis is, I'm lucky in terms of what I like, the market seems to like. So it makes it kind of convenient for me. I don't have such a unique flavor in cannabis that I have to find something that is only for me. But for a lot of people, that's the case, and so much so it's to take your time and sift through and find things that are attractive to you. And a lot of times when you see a variety, if it hasn't been well grown, it does not really reflect what the variety is. And if it hasn't been cured properly, meaning in the post-harvest handling, you really aren't experiencing it correctly. And so if someone says to you, you know, this is a variety with a lot of hype and people are digging it, and you see it and it doesn't, maybe you're not seeing it. And so that's what I found, is that it's trying to, if something has such velocity where people want this so badly, then there must be qualities in it, and we have to figure out how to express them. And then once we figure that out, is it worth it commercially to me? Like, is this delicate? Some strains are so delicate that they're really only meant for micro batch, where every aspect can be controlled in the smallest level, and that's stuff you compete with, or that's stuff that would be on a very, very limited production basis, or it's your medicine for you specifically. But on a commercial farming level, man, you got to find strains that hold it. They hold the flavor in the body when you smoke it. They release the volatiles when the flower's presented. If it doesn't do that, I don't want it, you know. And so I just keep hunting. And you will find these strains.
So when we talk about therapeutics in cannabis, you know, one concept I like to throw out there is a lot of times we correlate therapy and psychoactivity just a little too much with cannabis. You know, it's easy to confuse the two things. You'll hear people do it, medical patients, they'll take a hit off of something and say, wow, you know, that's some really heavy stuff, that's really medical, you know, or that's really gonna address my problem. But when you really come down to it, you really have to pull apart the concepts of therapy and psychoactivity. And some of the things that may have a greater psychoactive effect may not be the ones that particularly address your back pain. And so when you are actually in pursuit of identifying cannabis that works for you for a specific therapeutic application, one of the things that you want to do is make sure you actually pay attention to the therapeutic application and your response to it outside of psychoactivity. And I think it's one correlation that people just get really caught up in. And so what I say to people is, try the CBD strain, try the THC strain with the various terpene profiles, but pay less attention to how high you feel and more attention to how does your back feel. And for a lot of people we're still really mashing those two things together. So I really encourage people, especially providers who are interviewing patients and trying to align their cannabis products with that patient's needs, is to really pull apart questions about therapy versus psychoactivity to make sure that you get down to something that's a really sustainable and long-term solution for someone.
Anybody any questions while we're hitting it? Bam.
Hi. My name is Lonnie Painter. I'm from Senior Citizens Collective in Southern California. I actually have two questions. One is I want to make sure I understand what you're saying about the proper time to harvest and curing and drying. So you mentioned try to keep it under 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
In the drying process.
In the drying process. And would it be better than to harvest in the late afternoon when it was cooler, or?
Early morning best, because this way you
morning?
had the entire night for the plant to really re-put on its grease. And so I like to cut it early in the morning, and then by like 9 o'clock, I mean, here it's hot. Just like you're in SoCal, it's hot. So by 9 or 10 o'clock, man, you're cooking whatever you're sitting on the ground. So if we could work in cycles early in the morning for a couple hours, then get the product to the houses and get it all in place. So this way we don't ever get it cooked in the sun at all. It just holds it so much better.
Okay. My other question is, on these vapor pen cartridges, up until, maybe the last year or so, a lot of them cartridges, or maybe most of them, had polyethylene glycol or propylene glycol in them. And then last year there was a report from Project CBD that mentioned an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that said those pegs, the polyethylene glycol and propylene glycol, and the flavors they're putting into those cartridges are becoming carcinogenic. And so now I'm noticing most of these cartridges no longer state that they have the pegs in them. And now they tell me, no, we're using more terpenes and just more cannabis oil. But when I look at the labels, it will maybe be 500 milligrams of oil, 200 milligrams of THC, and maybe that will be it, or 5 milligrams of CBD. So my question would be, because they're telling me they've replaced the pegs with terpenes, and it just doesn't seem possible to me that the other 200 or 250 milligrams in there could be terpenes, since the plant, like you said, only produces maybe 20 milligrams of terpenes per gram. So
In that case, they would be adding manufactured terpenes to it, to have them in that kinds of level. I mean, you can naturally extract them and then add them back in as well. What you hear more and more pen manufacturers doing is actually buying terpenes from chemical supply companies and then using those as additives into their pens to add flavoring, and also as a diluent, because a lot of those terpenes are very much like a viscous oil, and they're very miscible with the cannabis oil, and so you can dilute your cartridge and make the concentrate flow more, which a lot of the cheaper cartridge technologies require an oil that flows more easily and able to get it in contact with the element. But the thing to be concerned about there is that there's a lot of terpenes available that you can purchase commercially that are not safe for human consumption. that are not for ingestion by humans. They're only for chemical use in laboratory or research use. It's actually not necessarily trivial to get ones that are actually classified the right way to be adding into those cartridges. And so I think that one of the things as a consumer that you want to make sure of if you're consuming a product that states that it's actually adding a significant amount of terpenes into the cannabis oil is what was the origin of those terpenes? Was it natural? Was it synthetic? Were they purchased in a way where it was clearly verifiable that they were intended for human consumption? So all those things are really important.
Look up popcorn lung.
No.
No.
Expensive. And the artificial terps, there's a problem with people that used to work in the popcorn factories. And so they call it popcorn lung, but now they're having that problem with e-cigs. And so it's just a matter of, how do you take cannabis and turn it into a product that I call it the modern culture because they smoke with an interface. We from the old school rolled it and smoked it, but now it's a secondary product and it's used through some device. You touch a device to consume it. And in that device, in that form that's coming, people who are unaware are like, hey, I'm smoking some stuff that tastes like cotton candy. And I'm like, well, where's that flavor coming from? Mm-hmm. That's just, we just assume this shit's clean. The tobacco manufacturers should have taught us a lesson on that.
Beyond, no kidding. Beyond terpenes, when you're just on the subject of vapor pen cartridges, there's a lot of issues around that, the entire technology. And I live in Sonoma County. We'd had an article in the Press Democrat a couple weeks ago about a kid who, it was an e-cigarette, not a cannabis one, but it blew up in his mouth and blew his teeth out. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I know, isn't it horrible? He had braces on. Can you imagine? Anyway, one of the things that you see also with cartridge technology is all the different materials that people are using. And when you have things like cannabis oil and terpenes that are very non-polar, they can actually do things like leach plasticizers out of plastics. I see people putting wax into these little silicone squishy containers, which are really cool containers, and they're purple and tie-dye. And guess what the wax does? Leaches the dye right out of the container and into the wax. And so in all these situations where you have things like terpenes and cannabinoids mixed together in concentrated ways in contact with synthetic materials, you also have to be concerned about the transfer of things like plasticizers into those oils as well. So just a little bonus on top of terpenes for you.
So we got a question here.
Yeah.
How late is the nursery open today?
Say again?
Is the nursery open today?
No, it's not. I let the guys come here to hang out. Otherwise, I banish them to the shop for the day, and that's kind of brutal.
Okay, my other question is, does Pure Analytics publish data as far as, say, strain-specific terpene profiles?
We don't make it like available on the web. If somebody wanted to call for a consultation, we absolutely have a database to draw on to look at what we may have seen in something we've tested in the past or different strains from different regions. But it would be on a personal consultation basis rather than something that we put out there. Although the work that we did for the Dep Cup, which was 105 samples. Kevin's done a lot of work with that data, and I know that that's posted, and I'll let you tell them where they can get to that.
Yeah, we did the golden tarp data got posted, and you can get that at the Ganjier.com. And then Dr. Abrams did a dig on it also, and so he took a look at it from another perspective also, so we could start trying to break cannabis into kind of terpenoidal bases of where really can we generalize. And it was a fascinating study that he did based off of this, and so he's right there. And so I would say for him to be able to speak to you so you can take a look and see how to access it from his direction also, because it starts helping you understand how do we really see cannabis. When we did the golden tarp, what we did is we broke it up into divisions in the way we understand it, in terms of tones and flavors. Because if we just do it off of potency, it always favors fuel-based strains. And what we wanted the judges to be able to get cannabis in front of them that was quality, that was from 15 up to 25. I didn't want the THC numbers alone to dictate this in terms of the sifting process. And as we broke it up using these tones, all of a sudden we started to see some neat patterns emerge. And It starts to allow you to really understand how we perceive things and how closely a lot of the smaller things fit into little subfamilies below the main families. And so it's fascinating to me. I'm an old smoker, you know what I mean? I've been doing this my whole life. And so all of a sudden we have this incredible window into what we do, and it explains so much of it. But at the same time, it doesn't explain everything. There's still a lot left.
No, there's flavonoids.
Yeah.
There's esters. There's
And
all
there's-
kinds of good stuff still left to explore too.
And so that's Dr. Abrams over there in the corner. And so if he could raise his hand, he could let people know how to access his situation.
I can just say it now, but you may have to repeat it. I don't know if
There you go.
Hey, thank you very much. So the work that Kevin is describing that I reported on, I recently reported at an Emerald Analytics conference in Las Vegas. This is an annual conference that's dedicated to trying to understand how to measure and what is measured in cannabis. It's the second year. It's a very, very interesting conference. Anyway, that is, it's publicly available through the Emerald Analytics Conference. They have made the slides available on their website, I believe. And I will be looking at some site to put this data up on. Maybe Ganjier.com would have an interest. It needs to get out there. People need to look at it. So I think that it will be available, and we can write up some descriptions so folks can understand what we've been doing. Can I ask a question? That,
John, you don't need to ask a question. I'm just teasing.
So, in other species, I'm thinking lilies, I'm thinking tuberoses. We're doing a big landscaping project at our home in San Diego. We're putting Brugmansia, which is Datura, that's the angel's trumpet that hang upside down.
Yeah.
Many of these are species that emit odors at night. So I know you were talking about time of harvest, but do we yet know in the cannabis plant whether there's a diurnal rhythm to any of these odorant?
I've never seen a paper on it,
Okay.
like in terms of a journal article. I've never seen a paper on it. I think that the perception of it and the ideas about are mostly anecdotal at this point in terms of what's the time-phased peak of terpene biosynthesis on a single day basis. Does it peak in the morning? Does it peak at night? I think the thing we have to think about are light and dark reactions in the plant. There's certain reactions that can only happen in the presence of light, and there certainly are certain terpenes that do require the presence of UV for biosynthesis. But there's also a lot of reactions that can happen at night in cannabis, and so or any plant really. And so what plants do during the day when they do photosynthesis is they build up all these little building blocks of sugar, they build malic acid and all these other different things. And then when the light is gone, because they need the light to build those sugars, and then when the light is gone, you have the dark reactions happening that don't require light. And that's taking those building blocks of carbohydrates and turning them into different things. And so it would be really interesting, I think, to do some studies, and Kevin, we could probably do it, to do some studies and look at what is the time-phased accumulation and peaks of terpene on a single day.
In a 24-hour
Yeah.
period,
Yeah, we should talk, because I have some ideas in this area as well.
Yes. Yeah, great.
Finally, quick question on the use of chemical desiccants in the curing process to maybe mitigate some of the evaporative loss of volatiles and all that. What do we know about, calcium sulfates or things like that you could actually use and just absorb the water out?
I actually know a fair number of dispensaries who use desiccants in relation to their samples before they submit them to the lab. Because they want to remove the moisture content will increase the potency results when they test it on a more dry weight basis. Generally speaking, the desiccated cannabis that I receive in the laboratory, although I can't say it from an objective, I've measured it and determined this basis, from an overall organoleptic perception, it seems to have reduced content, although testing would really be necessary to, say, validate that. But I'd say that's my anecdotal perception on the highly desiccated samples that come through the lab.
Because it's funny, because they have the Bovita packs, where it's the opposite. You can have a controlled release, and so instead of pulling the moisture out, it's going to supply it at a set
Mediate
amount.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the Bovita packs seem pretty good for holding stuff in terms of keeping the moisture stable. We have I think it got down to about maybe 10-12% humidity last year. I mean, it came right off the chart, and so there's nothing that can take that. And so the packs are kind of nice for that, to stabilize some of your product. In the real world, you're hoping to move so fast you don't have to worry about these problems. But Unfortunately, we do. And so I noticed that for my own cannabis that I smoke, you know, I store it in sealed containers with a 65% pack in it, and then when I pull it out to smoke it, I let it sit ambient for about an hour, and it drops some of that moisture and it solidifies a little bit, so then it burns a little better. The burnability's there. And I noticed the moisture content's too high in your cannabis, you don't experience the combustion that's required, so the flavonoids aren't present, terpenoids aren't present. So everything's got to be right. And it's just a matter of, you know, you keeping it right so that, you know, 7, 8, 10, 12 months down the line, when you break out your jar of goodie, it's still goodie, you know?
So I think we have time for one more question to keep this great event on task. And
you had mentioned like the 80-degree mark for dry space, and I'm kind of curious if you have a recommendation as to relative humidity and, you know, velocity of air movement as well.
Well, the velocity of air movement is, if I could have it, I like sealed dry rooms. And so really, I'm just trying to utilize the air that's in the space with mini splits to control it. I just don't want a lot of air moving about, you know, directly. I like circulators, but I don't want them blowing on the plants. And I think with humidity, you know, it's hard to get it below 45% without driving the heat up too. So I like electric heaters. I don't like anything producing any water vapor. So I mean, we've all done it. We've all used propane in barns and shit. It works, but in a perfect world, you know, I wanted to be able to control it. And if I start to get it below 45, then I have to start driving the heat up a little higher, and there's like a sweet spot. And so it's basically what the equipment can work with and what you can work with on your ambient where you're at. Because where your barn is or where you grow is going to determine a lot of it. Because if you're catching, you know, south wall anything, it's going to get hot in there. So that'll automatically bring the humidity down whether you like it or not. And then you're going to have to rehumidify a little bit if it's moving too quick. And you can do that with ultrasonic foggers or old school towel and water type shit.
so let's give it up for our panelists, Kevin, Patrick, and Samantha. And if you want to visit more and ask some more of your questions, please come visit them in the tent right next door here.